July 1972. A ruined, mud-splattered civilian cemetery on the bleeding, fire-torn outskirts of Quảng Trị City, South Vietnam. The sky above the shattered landscape is a low, suffocating blanket of gray ash, chemical sulfur, and stagnant humidity, torn apart every few seconds by the relentless, deafening thunder of heavy, long-range artillery duels. The ambient temperature has reached a brutal 98 degrees Fahrenheit. But inside the crumbling, moss-covered stone walls of the ancient graveyard, the stagnant air is thick with the sickening, greasy stench of vaporized cordite, burning diesel fuel, melted rubber, and the heavy, unmistakable odor of exposed human flesh rotting in the tropical sun. A sudden, terrifying burst of enemy 82mm mortar fire collapses a centuries-old concrete tomb, showering a pinned-down squad of American Marines with a violent spray of sharp gravel, gray dust, and pulverized ancestral bone. Within seconds, the survivors throw themselves face down into the red volcanic mud behind a cracked limestone headstone, their faces blackened by carbon soot, their skin stinging from flying rock splinters, their olive-drab uniforms shredded by hot steel shrapnel. This is happening every single hour of every single day, without a single moment of reprieve. Every single hour, somewhere across the devastated, defoliated landscape of the northern provinces, where the North Vietnamese army has launched its massive, overwhelming Easter offensive, young men are locking themselves in a brutal close-quarters embrace with death. The American Marines are running out of clean water, dry bandages, and functioning communication equipment. Their weapons are jamming from the fine grit of the red clay. Their nerves are frayed into paper-thin wires by weeks of continuous sleep deprivation, and the constant, agonizing chatter of automatic weapons fire echoes through the skeletal concrete ruins of the city like a chorus of angry, vengeful ghosts. But amidst the chaotic terror of this pulverized graveyard, there is one 19-year-old soldier who does not look like a frightened draftee, cowering from the concussive blast waves. He is a private first class from the industrial harbor docks of Baltimore, Maryland, and in his left breast pocket, tucked tightly behind his silver dog tags and a stamped metal cross, he carries a fresh, factory-sealed deck of playing cards that contain nothing but 52 identical copies of the Ace of Spades. To the military high command in Saigon and the Psychological Operations Division at Task Force Alpha, this card is a sophisticated warfare weapon, a terrifying calling card engineered to strike primitive, superstitious fear into the hearts of the communist fighters. To this young Marine, however, the card has become a crucial emotional shield. A cold, unyielding armor of manufactured ruthlessness designed to mask the hollow, shaking panic tearing at his own stomach. His name was Wayne Grizz Callahan, and before this afternoon is over, he will not perform an act of cinematic bravery or receive a silver star from a visiting general. He will simply roll over the body of a fallen enemy soldier to drop his signature mark, and the single, microscopic discovery he makes inside that wet uniform pocket will spend the next 50 years of his life, turning his symbol of absolute warrior power into an emblem of pure, unadulterated self-loathing. To understand the profound, irreversible psychological decay that Wayne Callahan's suffered in that Quảng Trị Cemetery, you first need to understand that the myth of the death card was one of the most bizarre, culturally tone-deaf illusions engineered by Western intelligence during the entire Vietnam War. The legend originally began in the mid-1960s, when American information officers mistakenly concluded from fractured, mistranslated historical texts that in traditional Vietnamese folklore, the suit of spades was viewed as an absolute, terrifying omen of death, bad luck, and spiritual damnation. believing they could wage a cheap, high-impact psychological war of attrition on the minds of the regional guerrilla fighters and regular troops. Several American playing card companies began manufacturing special bicycle secret weapon decks, consisting entirely of the Ace of Spades, shipping thousands of boxes directly to the units in the field completely free of charge. The young Marines took these cards and transformed them into a grim, macabre ritual of the bush. They slid them into the elastic camouflage bands of their M1 steel helmets. They left them between the cold teeth of dead enemy fighters, and they scattered them across the smoking ashes of burned villages as a warning to the invisible cadres watching from the tree line. It was an exercise in theatrical brutality, a desperate way for 19-year-old boys from the American suburbs to convince themselves that they were the ultimate invincible predators in a jungle where they were constantly being tracked, ambushed, and hunted by a native force. And that story begins not in the mud of the Quảng Trị graveyard in July, but months earlier in the concrete rows of a shipyard warehouse in Maryland, and later on a sun-baked supply dock at Cam Ranh Bay. Before the United States Marine Corps handed him an M16 rifle and a pair of heavy leather combat boots, Wayne Callahan's entire universe was defined by the industrial hum of the Baltimore shipyards and the rough, violent machismo of the waterfront docks. He was a boy born into a culture where any sign of vulnerability was treated as a physical liability, and sensitivity was viewed as a moral sin. His father was a commercial boiler maker whose hands were permanently calloused, blackened by grease, and missing 2 fingers from a structural crane accident in 1958. His older brothers were street fighters who spent their weekends drinking cheap rye whiskey, working the hulls, getting locked up in the cells of the local precinct. Wayne learned early that survival in a hard, unforgiving world required a man to build a thick, unyielding shell around his internal emotions. He learned how to swallow his tears when he was beaten. He learned how to talk loud, strike first, and look at the world through a mask of cold, unblinking indifference. His father used to tell him, standing under the massive, rust-colored shadow of a steel cargo ship while the rivet guns roared like machine guns overhead, "Wayne, the world don't care about your feelings, and it don't care about your prayers. It only respects the man who can look at blood without blinking his eyes. You show an inch of soft skin out here on the docks, and the dogs will tear you to pieces before you can even apologize." Wayne carried that heavy, defensive armor directly into the selective service system. When his draft notice arrived in the winter of 1971, he didn't try to find a medical deferment, a college excuse, or a soft desk job in the rear echelons. He packed his canvas duffel bag, looked at his mother without hugging her goodbye, and boarded the gray government bus to Paris Island, South Carolina, determined to prove to his family and the world that he was the toughest Marine in the entire regiment. At recruit training, the drill instructors quickly found that Wayne was a natural, highly resilient asset for the infantry. He didn't flinch during the live-fire exercises when the machine gun rounds snapped inches above his head. He drove his bayonet into the struck dummies with an aggressive, throat-tearing roar that impressed the combat veteran sergeants. They nicknamed him Grizz because of his heavy, imposing frame, his physical endurance through the swamps, and his quiet, brooding nature in the barracks. When his unit, Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, was deployed to the northern sectors of South Vietnam in early 1972, Wayne immediately embraced the darkest, most aggressive rituals of the combat troops to maintain his protective psychological shell. While other soldiers carried pocket-sized Bibles, Love letters from high school sweethearts, or lucky rabbits' feet dipped in gun oil. Wayne went to the base PX Bet and bought 3 decks of the specialized psychological warfare cards. He liked the clean, mechanical coldness of the black ink spayed against the white paper. It felt logical, orderly, and entirely heartless. On the line, he became the man who volunteered for the grimmest, most hazardous chores. When his squad ambushed an NVA patrol along the muddy dikes of a rice paddy, Wayne was always the first to step out into the open to search the pockets of the dead for tactical intelligence. And before he stepped away from the body, he would invariably pull a fresh Ace of Spades from his shirt pocket, snap the paper between his fingers with a sharp, echoing crack, and slide it under the canvas webbing of the dead man's gear, or press it into an open, bleeding wound. He did it to maintain his status as the squad's hardcore warrior. He did it because every time he dropped a card, he successfully convinced himself that he was an invincible instrument of a grand historical machine, a predator who was completely immune to the human misery bleeding in the dirt around him. By July 1972, however, the sheer, unprecedented scale of the Easter offensive had turned the northern provinces into an absolute furnace of conventional, heavy violence that shattered the bravado of even the toughest soldiers. The North Vietnamese army had crossed the demilitarized zone with heavy Soviet-made T-54 tanks, massive long-range 130mm artillery batteries, and thousands of highly disciplined, regular infantry troops who had been trained for industrial-scale warfare. The progress of the conflict was no longer measured in small jungle skirmishes or body-count diplomacy. It was measured in entire city blocks destroyed. Thousands of heavy artillery shells exchanged per hour, and rivers clogged with civilian and military wreckage. Wayne's platoon had been inserted into the shattered outskirts of Quảng Trị City, tasked with holding a desperate defensive perimeter around an ancient, walled civilian cemetery that sat on a strategic crossroads leading to the city center. The environment was a surreal, horrific landscape of utter desecration. The heavy artillery impacts had torn open the old concrete tombs and family vaults, scattering the dry bones of generations of Vietnamese ancestors into the wet mud, mixing them with the fresh, twisted iron of destroyed military trucks, spent brass casings, and the canvas webbing of discarded gear. The heat was an active, suffocating weight, rising off the wet clay in shimmering waves that smelled of sulfur, stagnant river water, and rotting organic matter. The Marines had been fighting from inside the open graves for 5 consecutive days and nights, their faces hollowed out by sleep deprivation, their eyes permanently bloodshot from the salt of their own sweat, and the chemical smoke of the white phosphorus rounds that burned endlessly in the ruins. The squad had become a collection of silent, terrified ghosts who had completely run out of illusions about military glory. There was Sergeant Barnes, the squad leader, whose hands shook so violently from shell shock that he couldn't hold his map straight or light a cigarette. There was Gomez, a big farm kid from Nebraska, who spent his nights chewing on his own leather gloves until his knuckles bled to keep from, screaming out in the dark. And there was Doc, the medic, who had run out of morphine on the 3rd day of the siege, and now used lukewarm water from his canteen to wash the fatal wounds of men who were already dying in the mud. They had no shared illusions about psychological dominance or ideological victory anymore. They knew with absolute clarity that a 3-cent paper card meant absolutely nothing to a Soviet-made 130mm shell that could vaporize a 4-man concrete bunker from 10 miles away without warning. They spent their days huddled in the wet earth, behind stone grave markers, listening to the high-pitched screech of incoming Faubin, praying that the stone wouldn't split under the next concussive impact. Wayne Callahan kept his mask on through sheer desperate willpower and psychological denial. He talked louder than the others during the brief lulls in the shelling. He cleaned his automatic rifle with an aggressive, obsessive violence, and he kept his left breast pocket pinned shut with a safety pin, the stack of black and white playing cards sitting directly against his skin over his heart. A fragile, pathetic shield against the absolute terror that was threatening to fracture his mind into pieces. On the morning of July 14th, the artillery storm stopped with a sudden, terrifying silence that signaled an immediate ground assault. Through the thick gray smoke that drifted between the shattered stone headstones and broken angels, the green uniforms and pith helmets of the NVA regular infantry appeared like apparitions rising from the mud. The graveyard erupted into a chaotic, close-quarters frenzy of automatic weapons fire, hand grenades, and hand-to-hand desperation. The noise was no longer a collection of separate sounds. It was a solid, crushing wall of physical pressure that distorted the senses. The deafening, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the machine guns, overheating in the sun. The concussive thud of explosions that showered the trenches with red clay, and the raw, guttural screams of young men killing each other with bayonets, combat knives, and folding shovels. Wayne Callahan fought with the feral, reactive instincts of a cornered animal. He fired his M16 rifle until the plastic handguard was hot enough to melt his gloves, changing magazines in the dark corners of a collapsed tomb. His mind completely shot to anything but the basic mechanics of immediate survival. He didn't see the sky. He didn't feel the rain. He was just a cog in the act of killing. When the enemy assault finally broke and the remaining NVA soldiers withdrew into the smoking tree line beyond the crossroads, the graveyard fell into a low, wet silence, broken only by the dripping of the rain and the groans of the dying. Wayne sat against a shattered concrete angel, his chest heaving in short, ragged gasps, his lips covered in a dry, white crust of salt, sweat, and gunpowder residue. His squad leader walked past, his uniform caked in red mud, his eyes fixed on the dirt in a blank stare. "Clear the perimeter, Grizz," the sergeant muttered, his voice flat, dead, and entirely drained of emotion. "Make sure none of them are playing possum along the wall. Put a card on them if it makes you feel better. Just get it done before the next artillery barrage hits us." Wayne rose from the mud, his boots heavy, his body aching from the massive adrenaline crash that left him hollowed out. He walked slowly along the low stone wall of the cemetery, his rifle raised to his cheek, passing the bodies of 3 NVA soldiers who had been cut down by a machine gun crossfire near the entrance. He stopped over the 4th body, a young NVA soldier lying face down in a shallow ditch, half filled with muddy rainwater. The soldier was small, wearing a faded green utility uniform that was torn at the shoulder. His hands stretched out across the mud, as if he were trying to reach the stone wall for safety before his breath failed him. Wayne felt the familiar, habitual urge to assert his dominance, to validate his own survival by dropping the signature mark of the predator. He reached into his left breast pocket, unpinning the fabric, his fingers sliding past his silver dog tags to pull out a single, fresh ace of spades. He snapped the card against his palm, stepped down into the wet ditch, and used the toe of his heavy leather boot to roll the dead soldier over onto his back. The card slipped from Wayne's fingers, drifting down into the muddy water before it could even touch the green uniform fabric. The face looking up from the mud wasn't the face of an anonymous ideological fanatic or a terrifying guerrilla warrior. It was the face of a boy who looked no older than 16, his skin smooth and yellowish beneath the gray layer of soot, his lips parted, slightly, as if he had been interrupted in the middle of a sentence. But it wasn't the boy's extreme youth that struck Wayne like a physical blow to the chest. It was what had fallen out of his unbuttoned shirt pocket when his body was rolled over in the dirt. Sitting flat against the wet green fabric of his uniform was a small, plastic-wrapped photograph. Wayne's breath caught in his throat, his heart slamming against his ribs, with a sudden, violent force that made his head spin and his knees go weak. His hands shook so violently. He dropped his rifle into the clay as he reached down, his fingers wet and muddy, to pick up the plastic square from the dead boy's chest. He peeled away the cheap plastic layer, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at the image inside. It was a black and white photograph of a young woman with long, dark hair braided over her shoulder, standing next to an old, wrinkled grandmother on the wooden porch of a small, thatched house. The woman was holding a tiny infant wrapped in a hand-woven cloth, her face lined with a soft, tired smile that looked directly into the lens of the camera. Wayne's mind fractured in that single, suffocating second. He didn't say a word, but his hand instinctively reached down to his own hip, his fingers fumbling with the snap of his canvas wallet. He pulled out his own plastic-wrapped identification folder and slid out the photograph he had carried, next to his draft card for 13 months. It was the exact same photograph. Not the same people, but the exact same human geometry of love, worry, and waiting. Wayne's photograph showed his sister, his aging mother, and his newborn nephew standing on the concrete steps of their row house in Baltimore, their faces lined with the exact same soft, anxious smiles, looking into the lens, with the exact same silent prayer that the boy holding the camera would come back alive. The realization broke through Wayne's manufactured armor like a heavy artillery shell, shattering the grand architecture of his warrior myth into dust. This boy in the mud MCF hadn't crossed the mountains to destroy freedom. He had carried a rifle into the graveyard for the exact same reason Wayne had, because a government machine 10,000 miles away had drawn his number in a lottery of power, stripped him of his name, and sent him into the furnace to kill another mother's son. The Ace of Spades floating in the muddy water next to the dead boy's boot wasn't a symbol of psychological power or cultural supremacy. It was a sick, cruel joke, a childish piece of cardboard used by terrified teenagers to hide the fact that they were nothing but anonymous cogs in a machine of pure, indifferent slaughter. Wayne Callahan didn't drop another card for the remaining 3 months of his tour of duty. He didn't wash the dead boy's photograph. He slid it deep inside his wallet, right behind his own family's picture, so that the two images sat back to back in the dark, touching each other through the old leather. He became completely silent on the line, refusing to volunteer for the search teams, speaking only when a direct command required an answer. He kept his remaining decks of cards hidden in the dark bottom of his rucksack. And, on the night before his unit was pulled off the fire step to return to the rear echelon, he took the boxes out to a diesel-burning trash pit behind the bunkers and threw them into the flames, watching the 52 black spades curl into black ash under the intense heat. He didn't feel like a survivor when he finally boarded the commercial charter flight out of Tan Son Nhut Airport in October 1972. He felt like a thief who had stolen his life from a better boy in a graveyard. He returned to Baltimore, but the tough harbor town he had left behind felt like a completely foreign country that he no longer belonged to. He refused to go back to the shipyards or work on the docks, unable to tolerate the loud, aggressive bravado of the workers or the smell of burning oil and hot metal that reminded him of the Easter offensive. He took a job as a night shift groundskeeper at a small historical civilian cemetery on the rural edge of Maryland, working 12-hour shifts from dusk till dawn, because the quiet, silent rows of the civilian dead were the only spaces where his mind didn't feel, crowded by the screaming ghosts of Quảng Trị. He never married. He never went to the local VFW bars to swap war stories, and he never wore his veteran's cap to the July 4th parades, choosing instead to spend his anniversaries sitting on his porch in the dark while the town celebrated a glory he knew was a lie. By the time the 2000s arrived, his hair had turned a premature silver, matching the gray limestone of the headstones he tended every night. His family noticed that he carried a strange, unbreakable habit that seemed to govern his entire psychological existence. Every year on the 14th of July, the anniversary of the graveyard battle, Wayne would lock the doors to his house, pull down the shades, and sit at his kitchen table under the light of a single bare bulb. He would reach into his shirt pocket, pull out an old, worn leather wallet, and slide 2 photographs out onto the oilcloth. He would lay them flat next to each other. The family from Baltimore and the family from Vietnam, their gray faces looking up at him through the dim light. Then he would pull a single, ordinary deck of playing cards from a drawer, find the Ace of Spades, and use a pair of heavy kitchen shears to cut the black symbol completely out of the paper, reducing the card to a pile of white confetti. He would close his eyes, press his calloused hands over the 2 photographs, and let the quiet walls of his kitchens dissolve into the gray smoke of Quảng Trị, spending the entire night in a silent, permanent apology to the boy who had died with his family's picture in his pocket. He did this for 44 years, a solitary priest, performing a penance that no one else could understand, carrying the weight of an invisible twin who had been buried in the red clay of Asia while Wayne grew old in the rain of Maryland. The official military histories would publish grand, multi-volume books about the defensive victory during the Easter offensive, detailing artillery tonnages, tank losses, and enemy casualty figures calculated down to the last digit by computers in Saigon. The generals would receive their shiny distinguished service medals, and the politicians would write their lucrative memoirs about tactical resilience and the containment of totalitarianism. The veterans of Vietnam knew the system would simply wait for them to die of their wounds, their cancers caused by Agent Orange, or their own broken hearts, before acknowledging the raw, unfiltered truth of what happened in those ruins. But the truth didn't require a marble wall in Washington, D.C., or a speech by a politician to exist. It didn't care about who held the city or who abandoned the crossroads. It existed in the permanent, pocket-sized ledger of a 19-year-old's guilt. It existed in the dark, back-to-back connection of 2 photographs inside an old leather wallet, a silent monument to a common human tragedy that only one old man was left to remember in the dark. It was a truth that didn't change with the decades, a truth that sat quietly in the dark corners of American towns, ticking away like a clock that could never be rewound. If you had been in Wayne's position in that cemetery, would you have kept the dead soldier's photograph as a reminder of your shared humanity? Or would you have left it in the mud to save yourself from the guilt? Does an everyday object carry the moral weight and the ghost of its owners? Or is it just a piece of plastic-wrapped paper? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more raw stories that peel back the myths of military glory to find the human heart underneath, make sure to hit subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and let's discover history together.